Welcome to Yorkton Stories. Twice a month, we look at Yorkton's past and present. Today, the second of two podcasts about the Balmoral Hotel. Almost 9 decades, a Yorkton landmark with a fascinating history. My name is Dick DeRuyck. I was a co-founder, co-owner, and editor of Yorkton This Week newspaper, and have owned and operated other businesses in Yorkton over the past almost 50 years. While this podcast is largely a labor of love, we are grateful for the support of Harvest Meats and Grain Millers Canada, both here in Yorkton, and others who help out and listen to our stories. Our podcasts are heard on our website, yorktonstories.ca, where you will also find photos, links, and other information associated with each podcast when available. In many cases, you can not only hear the stories, you can also see and read information about the podcast topics. We can also be found in all major podcast directories, including Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, TuneIn and Alexa, and iHeartRadio. Search for Yorkton Stories, and you will find us. In the previous podcast, we had a long look at the Balmoral Hotel in the era of Harry Bronfman, whose father Ekiel bought it for his 2 sons, Abe and Harry, in 1905. The Balmoral was built in 1897 by R.C. Arnold and was first known as Arnold House. In the early 1900s, there were 2 other hotels in Yorkton. The Royal Hotel, just down the street from the Balmoral, had been completed in 1883, and in 1902, the Yorkton Hotel was built on 2nd Avenue, just north of Broadway, by James Lee of Winnipeg. The Yorkton Hotel is the only one of the 3 that still stands. Harry Bronfman, the sole owner of the Balmoral since 1908, bought the Royal Hotel in 1911 and turned operation of it over to his soon-to-be brother-in-law. The intent was to tear it down and replace it with a better hotel. It was torn down in 1918, but it was never replaced. A brief recap of the previous podcast. Harry had operated the Balmoral in the early years, as well as a business he started in 1915 with the advent of prohibition in Saskatchewan, the Canada Pure Drug Company. It produced alcohol for medicinal purposes because during the 9 years when alcoholic beverages could not be sold or consumed in public, it could be prescribed by doctors and supplied by pharmacies. Later, when the United States imposed prohibition in 1920, but Canada allowed the production of booze, but only for export, Harry and his younger brother Sam went into the business of blending and bottling booze for export, much of it going directly south into North Dakota and Montana, with American rum runners coming to Yorkton and later to warehouses along the border, which the Bronfmans set up so that their American customers could pick up their goods. Harry left Yorkton in 1921 and moved to Regina, by which time Frank Bruner had been hired to manage the Balmoral. The Yorkton Hotel on 2nd Avenue was purchased by the Bronfman family in 1927, when Harry was already living in Montreal. The Bronfmans were never actively involved in the operation of that hotel. In the late 1920s and 30s and the Second World War years, they leased both the Yorkton and Balmoral hotels to Frank Bruner. In 1945, they sold both to Frank's son, Frank Jr. Frank Bruner, who died in 1947, began managing the Balmoral for Harry in 1918. When the bar was closed at the start of Prohibition in 1915, a major source of hotel revenue disappeared, and the maintenance of the facilities suffered. Bruner used the time to do renovations, and by the mid-1930s, when hotels were again allowed to serve beer by the glass, things were looking up. Brunner was affectionately called mine host by his guests in recognition of the fine food he served. The Balmoral became a favorite spot for banquets and was known for special dinners at Christmas and New Year's, according to The Whiskey Man, a short book published in 2003 about the history of the Balmoral and the Bronfman years by the city's Heritage Advisory Subcommission. It became a classy place again, and because of Brunner's avid interest in sports, it was transformed into a reputable sportsman's gathering nook, the book states. But it goes on to note that by the middle of the Second World War, the dining room had closed. The large dining room table was still there, but now it hosted poker games. The Balmoral Hotel came up for sale in 1950. It was purchased in March that year by two families in Winnipeg, Emanuel and Marj Balacko, and Mike and Lil Yaroshak. Yorkton was enjoying a post-war boom. The first international documentary film festival was held. The Co-op opened its first store on Betts Avenue. Cradle telephones were installed in the city. The Bank of Montreal opened a branch in town, and the Crest Drive-In Theatre opened on the southeast corner of Broadway and Highway 9. The Balackos, including their toddler Ron, who was 2 at the time, moved into the hotel, where young Ron lived until he went to Winnipeg to attend the University of Manitoba, where he obtained his law degree. He moved back to Yorkton after graduation and has been practicing law here since 1976. Ron's mother, Marjorie, was born in Winnipeg, the daughter of Ukrainian settlers who had come from the same area of Ukraine as her future husband, Emanuel. The Canadian government was aggressively promoting immigration to Western Canada under Clifford Sifton, Member of Parliament from Brandon, who had joined the Laurier government in Ottawa in 1896 and became the federal minister of the Interior, responsible for immigration and settlement of the prairies. Ron's father, Emanuel, on the other hand, had an adventurous life as a child and a youngster in Ukraine. We talked to Ron about his parents, about the stories his father told him about his youth and his journey to Canada as a very young man, about the Balmoral, and what it was like to live in a hotel through his younger years.
He grew up in Ukraine in a small village called Mitku. It's on the banks of the Dniester River, about 30 miles north of the city of Chernivtsi. Now, Chernivtsi is a city of about 300,000 people. It's got a big university there, and the city is either the twin to Saskatoon or the universities are twinned. So there's a strong connection between Saskatoon and Chernivtsi. But back to the village, Dad and his two brothers grew up in the middle of the First World War. The village was right on the banks of the Dniester River. One of the opposing armies was on the far side of the river, and the second army was behind them. The river itself was a wide river, and the hills on either side of the river were similar to the Capel Hills, quite high, and the river was quite large, so that the armies really couldn't get at one another, but they'd lob shells at each other all the time, and the village was in no man's land. As Dad told the story, his mom would bake bread in the morning. The boys would put it in sacks over their shoulders and carry it up the sides of the valleys and sell it to the troops behind them, and also sell it to the troops on the other side of the river. They would engage in a lot of black market trading in the sense of eggs, chickens, liquor, so that they tried to help out both armies, and the soldiers, that neither army really touched anyone in the village. They were quite happy to leave the village as a non-combatant in the war and recognize the fact that they got help from them. And on top of that, the boys would get dynamite from the soldiers, or they'd take explosives from unexploded artillery shells, and they learned how to use that to blow up fish in the river and net them, and then supply the troops in the trenches with fish so that they would have something to eat. A couple of things resulted from that. as boys, they became men very quickly. And secondly, they became pretty proficient with explosives.
This was quite entrepreneurial on their part.
Extremely entrepreneurial.
Yeah.
Yeah, like majorly so. When the First World War ended, the village had been relatively unharmed, other than mustard gas had floated through on a couple of occasions. And I remember my father showing me the mustard gas burns he'd had on his legs when he'd walked into a field in a slight hollow, and the mustard gas was still lingering there. But other than that, the village was not hurt. When the war ended, the Soviet Revolution had already started. My father's father was a farmer. He had a land holding. It wasn't very big. It's probably 4, 5, 6 acres. But the family had a meeting, as I presume most families did, and they made a decision that in all likelihood, the boys were lucky they survived the First World War, but they wouldn't survive the Soviet Revolution. They'd have to take sides, and probably some of them, if not all of them, would get killed.
They were what, 12, 13, 14 years old at the time?
Yeah, maybe 14, 15.
Yeah.
Towards the end of the war, they'd be 15.
Yeah.
My father, I think, was 14 or 15. His older brother was a couple years older, and his younger brother was a couple years younger. So they made a decision that the 3 boys would go to Canada, and mom and dad and the 2 girls would stay home. So that's in fact what they did. I don't know how far they walked, but he said they walked for weeks and finally got to a place where they could get to London. They got to London, spent some time there, and then transited the Atlantic and got to Montreal, spent a little time there, and then ended up in Winnipeg. In Winnipeg, the very first place my father got a job, and his brother as well, my father got a job in the quarry at Stony Mountain. And his brother got a job driving a gravel truck at Stony Mountain as well. So their experience with explosives came in handy. He said that lasted as long or until one of his friends got killed by an explosion that didn't go off. His friend went to investigate what happened with it, and as he got to where the explosives were, they just blew everything apart. He said he walked out of Stony Mountain that day and never looked back. Ended up going to work in Canada Packers, which is a packing house that slaughtered a lot of beef. And he worked there for a long time and became a very expert butcher. Now, along the way, they became renovators of houses. They'd buy up old houses, renovate them, and then rent them out. And as well, he became a partner in a steakhouse in Winnipeg, Jimmy's Steakhouse, which was right across from the Balmoral Hotel. He had some knowledge of business, and he had some knowledge of building, and he had some knowledge of renting. And at some point, he decided he wanted to have his own business and get into it in a bigger fashion.
Somewhere along the way, I'm assuming he and your mother got married in Winnipeg, did they?
They got married in Winnipeg, yep. And she was also had an entrepreneurial spirit to her as well. When she was, I think, 14 or 15, her mother had worked at Shore's Candy Factory in Winnipeg. She was a floor lady. Her mother got sick and couldn't go to work. And in those days, if you got sick and didn't show up for work, you lost your job. So what all mom's sisters did was dress her up in her mom's clothes, and mom went to work at Shore's Candy Factory as a floor lady. And by the time the owners realized that it wasn't her mom working there, it was already about 2 weeks gone, and she was doing such a good job that they gave her the job. That was basically a management position where you look after the employees, you make sure they're getting the job done, you interface with the owners. Along the way, she met Dad, they got married, had me, and then I think he had a dream that he wanted to get into the hotel business.
And she obviously shared the dream.
Neither one of them were the kind of people that would work for someone for an hourly basis, payday's Friday. That wasn't their lifestyle. For some people, that's their lifestyle. That wasn't theirs. Whatever they could accomplish, and they were both what was referred to as quick studies. They wanted to go into business for themselves. Thought the hotel business was a good way to do it. My father and his best friend, Mike Yarashak, decided to buy a hotel. Roughly at the same point in time, my father's first cousin Dan Balacko, also wanted to buy a hotel. My father's brother, Bill Balacko, wanted to buy a hotel. And I guess to them, owning a hotel was a big deal. What happened was that mom and dad, my father and mother, had friends who had moved to Yorkton, Mike and John Manzik, who had bought City Bakery, and they had been in touch with each other. And Mike and John extolled Yorkton's virtues and talked about what a great place it was to live and do business. The Balmoral Hotel came up for sale in Yorkton. The Broadway Hotel came up for sale in Yorkton. It was located on the corner of 5th and Broadway, where Thane's car lot used to be. The Emerson Hotel came up for sale in Emerson, Manitoba, in that time frame. Dad, as I indicated, had been in the steakhouse business. He'd been a head butcher or head meat cutter at Canada Packers. And he and his best friend decided to buy the Balmoral Hotel. Dad's brother decided to buy the Broadway Hotel. Dad's cousin, Dan, decided to buy the hotel in Emerson, Manitoba. So all three of them bought hotels and started to run them.
Were the Yarashaks involved in the operation as well?
For the first 3 or 4 or 5 years, because they were very close friends. In fact, about 6 months ago, someone brought a brass ashtray to me that had the partnership on it, Balacko and Yarashak Partners, Balmoral Hotel, which I hadn't seen, but it goes back a long way when there was only 5 numbers and a phone number. After about 4 or 5 years, Mike Yarashak, I don't think he enjoyed being in the hotel business as much as he thought he would. And they ended up selling the business to my father. And then they moved back to Winnipeg.
Now, your family lived in the hotel. At the time, the hotelier had a suite and would live in his own property.
Yeah, there was actually 2 suites. The Balackos lived in 1 suite. It was a 2-bedroom suite. And the Yarashaks lived in another suite. It was a 2-bedroom suite. They were side by side in the north side of the hotel, what I call the back part of the hotel. Yeah. Nice suites, similar to an apartment. Probably each was between 1,000 and maybe 1,300 square feet in size. Obviously offered easy access to the actual business itself.
You grew up there. I mean, you were, what, 1.5 years, 2 years old when you came to Yorkton. Until you went away to school, you would have lived there.
I did. I lived in the hotel right up to the point in time that I ended up going back to Winnipeg to go to the University of Manitoba.
So what's that like for a young boy and a teenager to live in a hotel? I mean, what did your friends think about that? I mean, this is unusual. This is not something that everybody would experience. What's your memory of that? Until
you're 6 years old, when you go to school, you don't really know any difference.
Yeah.
You know what you are and what you have and what you do, but you don't really know what you don't have. Any kid, until he goes to grade 1, his life revolves around his mom and dad and some family members. In those days, I don't think there was a lot of childhood friends in the sense of non-family friends, but there was lots of childhood friends that were family friends.
Yeah.
Like my mother and father always continued their close ties with their families in Winnipeg. And we would go back to Winnipeg probably 5, 6, 7 times a year. And in those days, it wasn't like you went out to eat in a restaurant or you stayed in a hotel. You basically just bunked in with other family members. And, you know, I'm very close to all of my cousins.
Yeah.
You spend all your young years with them, and that's who become your friends. When I got back to Yorkton, you're not missing other children because you don't really know other children. Yeah. At that age, your whole life still revolves around your mom and dad. There was only one other boy living in downtown Yorkton, and that was Wee Yee. And as soon as we discovered one another, we became very close friends, and we're still friends to this day.
That was Yee's restaurant.
Exactly. He lived there with his family, and I lived in the hotel with my family. But I can't recall the exact time we met, but I'm thinking it's probably likely once we both started grade 1.
Yeah, because when you start school, that would change. I mean, you would have school friends. In those days, school friends would get invited over. You'd go to their place. Did that happen? I mean,
Oh yeah,
yeah.
that was common. Like I've got pictures of birthday parties where be a dozen kids showing up at a birthday party, a 7-year-old or 8-year-old birthday party.
Was having your birthday party at the hotel a cool thing with the other kids?
Oh yeah, they got pop and chocolate bars. They got everything. If we'd go to Henry Figgy's house, his mom would do all the home baking.
Yeah.
We go to Wee Yee's place, we'd get Chinese food.
Fruit. The Balmoral was considered a good hotel in the 1950s when it served local people in the bar and provided rooms for weary travelers and salespeople. By today's standards, it would be considered very plain, but in its day, it stood up well against the competition.
The hotel was in 3 sections. The West Wing was the one built first. The next one was the East Wing. And then subsequently, the last one was the North Wing. Unless you were familiar with it, you really couldn't tell that they'd all been built at separate times because they looked very similar. One of the big distinctions was that the rooms on the West Wing didn't have running water, the original one. And I think running water would have been quite uncommon around the turn of the 2 centuries ago, like 1900.
Yeah.
So that there was the main floor, a second floor, and a third floor. First floor had a common bathroom, and the second floor had 2 common bathrooms shared with the next wing. The East Wing, the rooms had a basin with running water. There was a shared bathroom, once again, in the hallways, and I think, as I recall it, each bathroom had 2 separate rooms where there was baths. Showers weren't really common yet. I don't recall there being a shower there. And then the last wing that was built was the north part. And in that part, the 2 rooms would share a bath. They called it a semi-private. Every 2 rooms had a bathroom that was shared between them, and it had a sink, a tub, and a toilet. The best rooms, the ones that had a shared bath, went for $375.
Yeah. Okay.
The ordinary ones went for $250.
At the time, those prices, even though they seem extraordinarily low now, it must have made business sense for them to price it that way.
Yeah. No, they were okay with that.
Yeah.
I think they purchased the hotel for $150,000, and that's in 1949. And I don't know what part was it they had as a down payment versus what they had to borrow.
Photos from the early days of the Balmoral show a very fancy, very ornate lobby, or rotunda, as it was called in those days, with a grand staircase going to the second floor.
Yeah, the lobby was very ornate.
Was it still ornate by the time your parents took over?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Absolutely. The stairway was kind of in the middle of the lobby. And to the west of the stairwell was the registration desk and the candy counter and the cigarettes and that sort of stuff. And then on the east side of the stairwell was a sitting room. That was a big sitting room with a couple huge oak tables in there and big leather couches, very comfortable.
Who looked after the front desk? Did your parents basically look after that, or did they have employees?
When they started in the hotel business, they had quite a few employees that worked there. As years went on, there was less and less employees, and they took over most of those duties. My mother mainly.
One of its notable features was the bar, a favorite watering hole for the men of the community for decades. One story about the bar was told over and over. In 1904, a group of men at the bar had their conversation interrupted by a regular customer by the name of Jack Bull, as he crashed into the place on horseback and rode up to the bar for a shot of whiskey. Years later, it was local rancher Scotty MacDonald, who had been riding his horse in the Orangemen's Parade, who also rode into the bar to order a drink. The building to the east of the Balmoral was still there when the Balackos operated the hotel. Originally built by Harry Bronfman for his liquor operation, by the 1960s, It housed the original offices of the Parkland Community College, then headed by John Usorin. It housed the first offices of SIGN, the Society for the Involvement of Good Neighbors, managed by Elton Davidge and then Clay Serby. And as Ron recalls, it was home to a business called Quick Freeze.
I remember the Quick Freeze because you're talking the 1950s and early 60s before people had freezers. What would happen where you could rent a locker in a room that was frozen, and then you could store your frozen meat and things in there.
Kind of like a safety deposit box for frozen food.
They also had meat in there for sale.
In 1980, with Emanuel and Marjorie having operated the hotel for 30 years, and the hotel business undergoing immense changes, the Balackos sold the hotel to the Billet family from Prince Albert and retired. Were your parents at that point, were they ready to retire?
Yeah, they were. They were already in their 70s. And when they bought the hotel, 1949, 1950, travel in Canada was mainly by railway. The roads hadn't really been built into highways yet. If you wanted to go to Winnipeg, you kind of went east down number 10 highway to Tonkin, then you went south to Rokeby, then you went a little bit east again, and the roads weren't good. The hotel had been built to serve the railway, CP Railway. Basically, just across the street and down the block was the passenger station. But after Mom and Dad bought the hotel, what started to happen was, and it was after the Second World War, the United States started building freeway systems and good highways that was basically modeled after what Germany had. And then Canada started doing the same thing. And a lot more people started to travel by automobile as opposed to train. What started being built were motels and motor hotels. And people wanted to be able to drive their car right up to the place they were going to spend the night. So the whole concept of travel changed. Nature of the business changed. Hotels became very popular. Motor hotels became very popular. And the amount of business that they had in downtown hotels shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. Think of the railway now. It's non-existent to most people other than the annoyance of the whistle.
Yeah, exactly.
Nobody thinks about going anywhere on the railway.
The railway had stopped transporting people. Passenger service on the Canadian Pacific rail lines was largely eliminated by the mid-1960s. So with the changes in travel patterns and habits by travelers, parking space was needed for a clientele that was arriving by car. Emanuel Balacko bought what was then the York Theatre on the east side of 3rd Avenue South, between Broadway and Livingstone Street. The theater had been built in 1918 by Harry Bronfman and was originally called the Princess Theatre. The name was changed to the Allen Theatre in 1923 and later to the York. As we mentioned, compared to the new motels that were springing up to serve those who traveled by car, the rooms in the old hotels were considered outdated, and the Balackos were not young anymore. They were ready to sell and retire.
I think at that point in time, my father was already 77.
Oh, okay.
And Mom would have been 74 or 73. They were still able to do it, but my dad's eyesight was failing a bit. I think he just realized that if they had to sell it sooner or later, and that was the best time to do it.
Where did they go after they sold?
They bought a house on Bradbrook, right across from the Orthodox Hall. My father loved fruit trees, so he had fruit trees. He had planted them at the hotel. There was sort of a courtyard there, and he planted a bunch of apple trees in there. And we're talking big apple trees, not crab apples. And then the same thing when they moved on to Bradbrook. He planted about a dozen big apple trees, and I just loved looking after them. And plus all sorts of other vegetables.
Emanuel died in 1991 at the age of 88. Marjorie in 1993 at the age of 85. The Balmoral Hotel burned to the ground in the early morning of February 12, 1985. Old dry wood and high winds defied attempts by the Yorkton Fire Department to put out the blaze, and 88 years of history was reduced to rubble. At the time, the hotel had 16 permanent residents who lost their home and belongings. It was believed the fire started in a common kitchenette used by residents and guests, which was open around the clock. In 1976, Ron came home to Yorkton to join the law firm of Jim Milliken.
Yorkton was basically home to me, although Winnipeg was a close second.
Mm-hmm.
I had a friend that had gone into law school at the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon, and he was starting to work. He was going to work with Jim Milliken in Yorkton,
Mm-hmm.
and he kind of mentioned that to me, and that I'd probably enjoy it. And I decided that I would try and make that a career.
And you did.
So far.
And of course, we were not going to end our conversation with Ron without asking him about that folktale or myth or fact about those tunnels under the streets of Yorkton, which Harry Bronfman may or may not have built when he was in the liquor business during his years at the Balmoral after the First World War and into the early 1920s. Nobody is prepared to say there weren't any. Nobody either is prepared to say that there were.
There's two trains of thought in respect to that. The first train of thought is that there's actual underground tunnels running either in a north-south direction from the hotel underneath Livingstone to the freight sheds on the CPR property, which is right across the street, or going in an easterly direction into the Canada Drug Company. And the other train of thought is that when the people are referring to tunnels, it's a metaphor for the concept of an underground railway. No actual tunnels.
Mm-hmm.
Now, which of those two is correct? From my point of view, I'm much along the same lines as Carly Simon. We'll never know who the song was written about.
That sounds a little bit like someone wanting to maintain the mystery that already exists. As a boy, you would have explored the lower level of the Balmoral. Was there any kind of evidence that something may have been there?
As you've said, I probably know every square inch of the basement area, except the dark areas where as a young child I was scared to go into. It's such a different infrastructure that it's tough to believe. Like in those days, any basement foundation walls were made out of stone.
Yes.
There were stones piled upon stones.
Field stone, often.
And sometimes pretty big field stones.
Yeah.
And in addition, there was parts of the basement that didn't have walls, that had no cement floor or anything like that. I think that's probably as far as you're going to get me to go. And once again, we'll leave it up to Warren Beatty and Carly Simon to tell us who the song was about. When she does that, you can come back and ask me again.
Well, Ron, thank you for not clearing up the mystery. Ron's reference to Carly Simon is related to her song released in 1972, a massive hit called You're So Vain. It has 3 verses where she sings about past relationships and the vanity of the men she was with. I bet you think this song is about you, she sings. She did reveal one of the subjects, actor Warren Beatty. There has been a lot of speculation over the past 50 plus years, but so far, the other 2, if there were 2 others, are still a mystery, much like the tunnels. We will all draw our own conclusions and believe what we want to believe about those tunnels. As for my thoughts, for what they're worth, digging long tunnels several blocks under town streets, not likely. Hard to do without someone noticing what's going on, and the town council of the day would have had some serious reservations about that, even if it was feasible. A tunnel from the Balmoral to the Princess Theatre. In the previous podcast about the Harry Bronfman years at the Balmoral, Lawrence Ford, in the CBC radio documentary by Corinne Larson we heard, talks about walking through that tunnel as a boy. There is no reason to doubt him. Harry owned the entire block on which the two buildings stood, and the backs of the hotel and theater almost touched. A tunnel didn't need to be more than a few yards long and could have been dug without detection. A tunnel under 3rd Avenue South to the pool hall on the west side of 3rd South, or to the drugstore on the north side of Broadway, which would have to cross the main street, also unlikely. A basement passageway to the building next door, which Harry built to house the Canada Pure Drug Company, where alcoholic beverages were blended and bottled? Almost certainly. He owned both buildings, and they were right next to each other. A tunnel to the freight sheds along Livingstone by the railway. The city engineering department has records that indicate water mains and sanitary sewers were installed under that street in front of the Balmoral in 1909, which may have complicated digging a tunnel under the street if that was indeed attempted. And longtime city engineer Matt Burnett is quoted in The Whiskey Man as saying that a lot of work has been done on the street in front of the Balmoral and adjacent buildings, but workers never did find any unusual excavations under the street when they were digging. Gary Fletcher, in the CBC radio documentary in the previous podcast, talks about a door leading from his drugstore to something under Broadway. Others, in the booklet The Whiskey Man, talk about doors in walls leading to spaces extending beyond the building foundations. There's no reason to doubt any of those people. But Gary Fletcher also noted that the space under Broadway was also accessible from a heavy steel trapdoor in the sidewalk in front of the store, and could well have been used to unload goods or coal for the furnace. Excavations from buildings to spaces under the streets is entirely possible. But in the days before electricity, and certainly before refrigeration, those spaces may well have been used for cold storage, or to hide illegal booze maybe, and may not have been the start or end of a tunnel. In an email to me earlier this year, former city historian and archivist Terry Prince said this about the tunnels: "I wanted to believe in the idea like every lover of folklore. But she came to a conclusion that there was no underground evidence of tunnels. There are no stories that are reliable, such as that tunnels existed underneath 2nd Avenue North from the Yorkton Hotel to the Balmoral or the freight sheds." She points out that during Prohibition from 1915 to 1924, when the tunnels would have been used, presumably, Harry Bronfman was not even the owner of the Yorkton Hotel. He didn't buy it until 1927. And she adds, the whole of Yorkton would have seen someone digging that long a distance. She acknowledges that there may have been a couple of tunnels, short ones between the Balmoral and other neighboring Bronfman properties like the theater on 3rd Avenue South, as mentioned, and the automobile business owned by Harry on the south side of Broadway, directly across the lane at the back of the Balmoral. When all is said and done, and it has all been said and written about over many years, and it was done well over a century ago, if it was done, I would tend to agree with Terry Prince, who wrote in a newspaper article some years ago, if we could uncover evidence of the existence of tunnels, Yorkton would really come into the limelight. However, in the absence of hard evidence of tunnels, Yorkton has enough of a true story about Harry Bronfman and his brother Sam and their entrance into the liquor business here in Yorkton. We will publish another podcast in January, just one this month, as we take a bit of a break for the holiday season. Visit yorktonstories.ca to hear all podcasts, and there you can also sign up to our email list so we can let you know when a new episode is available. Thanks again to our sponsors, Harvest Meats and Grain Millers Canada. Your comments and suggestions are always welcome. Get in touch through our website or by emailing Dick, D-I-C-K, at yorktonstories.ca. Thank you for listening.